Good afternoon, all. At the outset, a huge thanks to the entire team of the capacity building for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this academic fest. And it's indeed a pleasure and a privilege. I believe that knowledge sharing is knowledge gaining, and there will be many action points and learning points which are going to be taken away from these interactions, and it will be mutual because it will definitely be when there is an interactive session, we will also learn more about the different practices. So thank you all. Now, my session is on occupational safety, and this is in context of infectious diseases. Occupational safety means that safety at the workplace. So it's like a two-pronged approach. Work can have an effect on health, and health can have an effect on work. So when you talk about effect of work on health, it can be physical risks, it can be biological risk, it can be because of the use of certain chemicals. Ergonomic means maybe because of your posturing or standing for long, working in somewhere where there is a lot of noise pollution or other psychosocial risks. When you talk about work health on work effect, then what happens is that if we are not feeling well, then in some form there is a impairment in our decision making. So this might also cause an effect, and more so when we are working in a healthcare setup. So our judgment will have an effect on the patient. So it is important that both of them are balanced so that we have a safe environment when we are working in a hospital setup. Now, I am referring first to the OSHA standards. OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So this was the first one which came out with the standards for the safety of the healthcare workers. So there are different standards, like the first one, which is 1030, deals with the bloodborne pathogens exposures and how protect ourselves from these bloodborne pathogens. The second one, that is 132, deals with the use of the personal protective equipment. What sort of a personal protective equipment, like whether gloves or masks or gown, what sort of PPE needs to be worn. And the third is specific to the TB compliance. In India also, we do have occupational safety, and it is actually like a national occupational safety and health, which was started in 1970 in Gujarat, Ahmedabad. Subsequently, there have been alterations and there have been changes. We also have a national policy on safety, health, and environment at workplace, which is in short called NPSHEW in 2009. So in India, occupational safety basically is dealt by two divisions of the government. One is the Labor Ministry and the other is the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Now, the importance of occupational hazard was never felt so much, but in the last 1 year, when the entire world went through this raging pandemic, when we realized that along with the patient safety, we have to also consider the safety of the healthcare workers. So occupational hazards can be many. It can be, as I said before also, because of the bloodborne pathogens or other biological hazards. It can be when we are working with different chemicals, or like we can talk about housekeeping people who are working with various chemicals, with anesthetic gas exposures, respiratory hazards because of infections which are spread by airborne or droplets, laser hazards, workplace violence, which is another thing, hazards associated with laboratories, those which are dealing with infectious agents, and radioactive material. I will limit myself to the occupational safety with the infectious diseases. Now, CDC also has certain guidelines to assist the healthcare workers in assessing and reducing the occupational exposure, starting with hand hygiene, as we are all aware, that has like the pillar of prevention of infection, whether you talk about healthcare associated infection or you talk about safety of a healthcare worker, and even a small child now knows the significance of a hand hygiene. Then there is another, which is a guide to infection prevention in an OP settings. There is a guideline for disinfection and sterilization. These are all available online, and you can definitely search and download these guidelines, and maybe you can also tweak it to suit to your institution. You need not follow everything how it is being done in the West, but you can definitely make it more custom, taking some of the guidelines from these. There are guidelines for isolation precautions, management of multi-drug resistant organisms. You know that that's a huge challenge now. We get a lot of organisms which are multi-drug resistant, more so in a healthcare associated infections, cleaning of the environment, and also the healthcare worker personnel. So these are the different CDC guidelines. Let's do a small poll. There are 2 questions, and you can answer one by one. These are MCQs. The first question is, which is most effective in the hierarchy of control? So when you have a hierarchy, which one is the most effective? Is it PPE, substitution, elimination, and administrative control? The second question is, what percentage of occupational hazards are underreported in the developing countries? So there are percentages, as you can see, A, B, C, and D. I'll give you a few seconds to select the correct answer, and then we can go ahead and see what is the correct one.
Yeah, you have a minute to select the answers, and Srinath will give you a countdown when 15 seconds are remaining.
Yes. Okay, 15 seconds remaining now. The first question is, which is most effective in hierarchy of control? And the second question is, what percentage of occupational hazards go underreported in developed countries? Okay, your time is up. We are ending the poll now. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see whether how many of us wrote the correct answer.
Which is the most effective in hierarchy control? We have 56% saying PPE, 11% saying substitution.
Okay.
Okay. I think substitution has come twice, and then the correct answer, administrative control, only 33%.
Okay.
have said. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, so the hierarchy of controls, I agree, the PPE is very tempting, and we usually, most of us think that it is the most effective. But prior to the, I mean, like we can say pre-COVID era, the hierarchy of controls, even now in the COVID era, always has some amount of variations. But if you see this inverse pyramid shows us the best is elimination. Best is to physically remove an hazard. That is, suppose you know that a patient is having, like suppose even if you take a COVID for an example, if the patient is having COVID, you tell them to stay at home. I won't say lockdown, but I will say stay at home so that they don't mingle into the community. Substitution is the second one. Substitution basically means, okay, you know that there is a huge pandemic or it's spreading easily or something which is airborne. Then try to make sure that there is no overcrowding and people maintain a social distance, physical distancing. Coming to engineering control, these are very specific for airborne infections, like you know that there has to be a negative pressure room or a single rooms or a separate building. That is the third. Administrative control, yes, we can have many policies and procedures, but if you don't have these procedures being implemented and the resources being provided, like I tell you, go and wash hands. I want you to have a good hand hygiene, but I do not provide you a soap solution. I do not provide you sinks. That doesn't help. So that is administrative control. And PPE, which is considered least effective, but please remember that there is never a single final line which says that this is how it should go. Depending on the situation, there are certain conditions where PPE is also had a major role. So all of them work in tandem. So the most effective one is the elimination. I am going to talk about occupational hazard in context of blood and body fluid exposure, transmission-based infections. about the pandemics, especially because we are almost going through the pandemics, and lab exposure. So first, coming to the blood and body fluid exposure among the healthcare workers, and there are a few data from US and a few from India also. And in as per the CDC, in US hospitals, almost 384,000 percutaneous injuries occur in a year. And almost 2.5 lakh are because of the needle stick injuries from the hollow bore needles. And there is a net data called EPI, which basically stands for Exposure Prevention and Information Network. It's a very useful one. You can also have a look at it. It has certain forms like for blood and body fluid exposure, needle stick injuries, sharp injuries. So as per that data also, which was collated in 2003, it reports a rate of approximately 27 needle stick injuries per 100 beds in teaching hospitals. And as per WHO, the commonest cause of needle stick injuries, if you see it, HCV accounts for 16,000, HBV, that is hepatitis B virus, accounts for 66,000, and HIV accounts for about 1,000 in a year among the healthcare workers. And if you see the exposure wise, it is 37% with hepatitis B, 39% with hepatitis C, and 4.4% with HIV. There are other infections which also can be transmitted by these bloodborne pathogens like syphilis and malaria. And coming to the next question, which we're discussing about the occupational exposure in the developing countries, about 90% happens and 40 to 75% goes underreported. And that can be because of many reasons. It can be because of the lack of awareness. It can be because there might not be systems in place or availability of the resources or the know-how. We do have a few Indian data which have been published, and as per this, you can see that NSI in India range from 61 to 79% and about 2.3 to 4.5 per healthcare worker per year. And if the risk of infection is seen from these NSIs for HIV, HBsAg, HCV, the highest percentage of infection risk is with hepatitis B virus. Thankfully, we have a vaccination against it. The next is HCV, where we don't have anything, and HIV, which is the least, is 0.2 to 0.5%. And again, we have some form of a post-exposure prophylaxis for the HIV exposure. Blood body fluid are one cause for the bloodborne infection. It can also be semen and vaginal secretions, CSF, amniotic fluids, other bodily fluids can also significantly transmit these viruses. Coming to the excretory things like tears, feces, or urine or vomitus, usually HCV and HIV have a less risk unless there is a blood is visibly present. Saliva, there have been articles which have shown that it might carry hepatitis B because there have been people who have never had exposure but still turned positive to hepatitis B. So that is definitely a possibility. What are the reasons for this needle stick injuries or sharp injuries is because we many times forget the universal precautions and we do recapping. It's like involuntarily we go ahead and start recapping. That has been seen to cause many times needle stick injuries. Failure to use a personal protective equipment like wearing a goggles where the splashes can occur. Many a times unintentionally we can leave some of these sharps in inappropriate place. We forget, we think we'll take it out and we might keep by the bedside of the patient, or it might fall down and we forget to remove it, and then it causes a needle stick injury. Improper segregation. If you don't keep these sharps in a specified container, then also it has led to needle stick injuries. In a study in 2019 from India, it showed that fatigue also, like long working hours, has also been because lack of attention and you are very tired, that can also cause needle stick injuries. It has been seen among the junior medical officers. This is a data which I am sharing. The right side one is from my hospital, from my institute. We do a regular tracking of these needle stick injuries. And this is the other one is published in one of the journals. And what we have found in our data is that mostly it is seen when we are removing the needle from the Novopen or the insulin pen. It has been found the most common cause. We did have problems with the improper waste management also, but repeated trainings and making awareness, making them aware, we have been able to tackle it. The other thing which we also see is when the junior medical doctors are performing the surgery, there is always a chance of getting a needle stick injury, but many a times, of course, they are solid bore needles. Recapping has definitely come down. Sometimes patient moves when you're giving a injection or you're doing accessing a line. That is another reason which can cause a needle stick injury. What do you do when there is a needle stick injury? First thing is, do not panic, do not get scared. Wash it under running water. Do not squeeze it because that creates a negative pressure, and anything which is outside the surface gets sucked in. Just wash it under running water. And if you have your infection control nurse, fine. If you don't have, just inform your immediate superior. And would request you, if you have a form, that's good. If you don't have something like something called an incident form, which can be, in which you can write what happened, the name of the person who had this injury, and was the source known. Is the source known positive with an hepatitis B or HIV, or is the source unknown, or you know that the source is negative? And you can send to the appropriate department. Like in our hospital, we have quality department where we send, but you can send it to your medical superintendent department, or your own nursing department, or your director medical services. Then you report this to the emergency department, because you have to give your blood for the baseline investigations and then have a follow-up. This is how the entire cycle of a needle stick injury happens, because there needs to be action taken. Just by reporting it is not enough. What is the protection which I am giving to this healthcare worker? That is important. I know this is a very busy slide, but this shows the algorithm. Like if there is a blood and body fluid exposure, highest amount of risk is when it's a seropositive patient, it's a hollow bore needle, and in that case, whether the person is vaccinated for hepatitis B or not, and if the source is known. Lower is when it is a blood or body fluid which is not stained with blood other than blood, and it's a solid bore needle. And the third is the lowest is the exposure to the intact skin, or the source is known to be seronegative. So when you divide it into these parts, then you have to know the status of the person who has been the victim. I would not say patient, the person or the victim who had a needle stick injury. If you know that it is a negative patient, then you can just check if you want to give a tetanus for the status of the tetanus. If you know that the person is vaccinated and the exposure, we don't know from what is the source, then it is better that we do a anti-HBs titers. And if the victim is protected, then just counsel and look for tetanus status. And the highest risk, when you know it's a positive patient and you do a titers, if it's protected, yeah, counseling can be done and they can just check for tetanus. But if you know the anti-HBs titers are negative, you might have to give these patients immediately immunoglobulins and start the vaccination. And if it's a patient who is HIV positive, then even as per NACO, or a patient who is unknown, you don't know what is the source of the needle stick injury, we have to start on antiretroviral, preferably within 72 hours. Though 96 hours has been given as the upper limit, preferably within 72 hours. So that is how the algorithm goes for a needle stick or a sharp or a blood or body fluid exposure. How do you prevent? As I said, standard precautions, having educations to the healthcare workers, have a good pre and post exposure prophylaxis. When the person is joining in your hospital, have some basic vaccinations given to them, and post exposure prophylaxis like availability of antiretroviral drugs or immunoglobulin should be there. There should be a reporting format. As you can see, the underreporting happens because there is no formatted structure, or there is a fear that, okay, some action will be taken if I tell that I had a needle stick injury. Then vaccinations to these staff, good cleaning of the environment so that there are no dried blood or anywhere around. Never recap. Have a good biomedical waste policy in your place, good sharp container which is tamper proof. There are some user safety devices available. I'll just show you in the next slide. Also having some people make a high risk announcement, like if they say like I'm going now, Chechi, I'm going now and going to give a vaccine injection, an IM injection or an IV injection. So these are some of the things can also be used for preventing these needle stick injuries. These are some of the safety devices are there, like safety scalpel, safety hypodermic needle. We have this needle connector system. Like recently, some company person came and showed me that these are the needleless connectors which can be used. I agree they're slightly expensive, but I think in the long run, as more and more companies, these are going to come out. And at least in high risk areas, these can definitely be looked at. Then there are sharp, which can retract into the syringe or which can go back into the device, or self-blunting phlebotomy and winged steel butterfly needles. So these are the different safety devices for preventing of this needle stick injury. So now we have come to the second poll. So the questions, Srinath, will you be reading out that questions?
Yes, ma'am, I'm doing that. So now we have the second poll here. Andaru dayachesi answer cheyali. Sharps should be disposed in A, regular waste, B, container with a tamper-proof lid, C, don't know. And the second question is, which of the following is secondary biosafety barrier? Options are PPE, facility design and engineering features, respirators, none of the above. You have 30 seconds to go. Everybody, please answer. Sharps should be disposed in is the first question. And second question, which of the following is a secondary biosafety barrier? 10 seconds to go. Okay, the time's up. We are stopping the poll now. I'm sharing the results, ma'am. Ma'am, please continue.
Yeah. So I think 87% told that container with tamper-proof needles, glad of that. And 53 said PP for the second question, and 33% for the facility design and engineering features. So let's look at what is the correct answer in the subsequent slides. Yeah. So appropriate biomedical waste management, as you can see, yes, it is a tamper-proof sharp containers. Why we are saying tamper-proof? Because we don't want these used syringes or needles to be reused by people, right? It is dangerous. That itself is another different cause for causing various infections. So a tamper-proof waste container should be used. And also the use of personal protective equipment. Here especially we say goggles, and please do not substitute the goggles for the routine glasses what you wear, because that's not covered from the side or above and below. So there the goggles actually should be covering your eyes from all sides to prevent any mucous membrane exposure. Coming the second one, so that finishes our blood and body fluid exposure. The second is the transmission related infections. So Dr. Mustafa is going to take about this in detail. So I'm just limiting it to 2 slides. So transmission related is basically a transmission can happen, infectious disease can happen from a patient to a healthcare worker, or a patient to a patient, or a healthcare worker to a patient. It can be a direct contact because two people are interacting. It can be indirect, like we were talking about the environmental surfaces role in HAI. So it can also happen because of that, and that is where the role of environmental cleaning comes in and hand washing comes in. Then because of the droplets, infections can happen, and airborne infections. So there has to be precautions which are contact precautions. Some are droplet precautions based on the type of transmission and the airborne precautions. And sometimes it's not exclusive droplet. There are sometimes droplet with contact, or there are sometimes airborne with contact, depending on the type of the diseases. And these are all always in addition to the standard precautions. Dr. Gayatri is going to talk about it. Remember that these are called additional transmission. These are called additional precautions that are there in addition to the standard precautions. Would like you to understand something called point of care risk assessment. When we talk about the use of the PPE, that doesn't mean we put on the entire PPE and go everywhere. We have to evaluate the likelihood of exposure to the infectious agent. So this is called point of care risk assessment. What we need to look at is what type of patient I am going to, what specific interaction I am going to do with that patient, in which environment and under which conditions. Like I will tell you one example. In this triad of healthcare worker, patient and environment, when we want to choose PP, look at the transmission risk. Suppose I am going to a patient who is having a droplet infection, maybe H1N1. So am I going to by the side of the patient for something within the 3 feet? Yes. If I am going, I need to wear a surgical mask. Am I doing any procedure, or am I going to give them injections, or am I going to draw blood? That is the specific interaction. Yes, if I'm going to do, I will do a hand wash and then I will wear a glove. Okay. And if it is, suppose it's a single room, so I know that I will wear one mask, finish my task and come out under the available conditions. So this is what is called point of care risk assessment. So when we say PP, it doesn't mean you wear the entire thing. This I'm talking of the non-COVID infections. I'm not talking of the COVID infections. When we talk about the non-COVID, because there is more to the infections other than the COVID, there are many transmission-based infections. So whenever you are going to the side of the patient, what is the activity? What type of infection? Is the patient having a chicken pox? So is it a pregnant nurse who is going inside? Or is she vaccinated or not? If she is not vaccinated, let her not go. Let someone else be placed. This is what is called point of care risk assessment for any of these personal protective equipment. So where am I doing the task? What is the hazard? What is the health status of the patient? Which type of task I'm doing and what precaution needs to be taken is what is PCRA all about. Put some pictures of the PP. Yes, you can see this has become like a uniform for the healthcare workers now. So this is of course a COVID PP, and you can see the different type of masks, the simple 3-ply mask, the surgical mask with the visor, and the N95 mask, which is required to wear depending on the infection with which we are dealing with. There is something called a seal check or a fit check whenever you are wearing a N95 masks. This, some people also call it fit test, but actually it is fit check or a seal check. So there are two types of seal checks, a positive pressure check and a negative pressure check. So whenever you are putting on an N95 mask, put it, make it tight, and then exhale into the mask. And there should be slight built up in the pressure without any outward leak. If you put your palms around it, around your outer part of the mask, you should not get any air leak. This is how I have tested many times, many masks when they have come into the market in the beginning of the COVID, and we have rejected many of these, along with, of course, looking at the certificates. For a negative pressure, again, wear the mask, inhale in, and then see slightly the mask should collapse. And then if these two things are happen, that means that mask is a good fit for you. If it is not, first try to tighten the elastic which is there and then check it again. So that is a transmission-based precautions. Third is coming to our pandemics. We all know that for the past more than 1 year, 10 months, we are dealing with a pandemic which has actually challenged the healthcare sector. So this is not a very recent slide. This is a study which was done a few months back, in which a comparison for the mortality rate with the pandemic was seen. And as you can see, it compared swine flu, MERS, Ebola, COVID-19, and the SARS-CoV, and the casualty varies. You can see on the MOHFW dashboard on a real time what is the vaccination status, what are the, how many fresh infections, and what are the deaths happening there. So when we come to pandemic or talking about the specific present pandemic, we can divide a hospital into 3 zones. One is a lower risk zone, one is a moderate risk zone, and one is a high risk zone. Of course, there is one buffer area we always keep, area where we don't know the diagnosis or we don't know these are the suspected patients. So lower risk areas are those which are mostly non-patient care areas, or those where, you know, they are symptomatic patients or patients who are absolutely negative or no risk of exposure to COVID-19. Moderate risk areas are the ones where we have screening and triage clinics, or patients or the wards who are in which we have stable, suspected, or confirmed COVID-19 patients. And high risk areas are the ICUs, where different aerosol generating procedures are done, or patients who are on ventilators. So when you divide the hospital in these 3 zones, it is relatively easy. Remember, we were talking about elimination and substitution in the hierarchy of infection control. So it helps us in what is a risk mitigation, reducing the exposure to this highly infectious virus. So in COVID-19, go as per the regulations and recommendations from Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. If there are aerosol generating procedures being done, it is preferable to have negative pressure room or for a ventilator patient. If there is no negative pressure room, there can be a good exhaust where you can create a differential pressure. If you have good exhaust going out, then also can be used. This has been also mentioned in the NCDC booklet. Then whenever you're transporting a patient from one area, and not many people are fortunate to have a separate building or a separate floor for the COVID positive patients, and you might have to move these patients to the various areas for maybe even for investigations, then make sure something called a green corridor where the patient, the other patients or the healthcare workers don't walk, and those who are in PP only transport the patient to that particular investigation and bring them back. Have a dedicated equipment in the COVID ICU and COVID ward so that it does not spread from one area to other, or even the healthcare worker who is handling like maybe a cardiologist who is doing an echo doesn't get infected because it has spread from the equipment to other. Have a zero visitor policy, because people who are infected, their colleagues or their home people can also, family can also be infected. Thorough environmental cleaning with 1% hypochlorite, and training for doffing and donning. These are the important components to protect a healthcare worker during the present pandemic. The key preventive strategies have been universal masking. Universal masking basically means when a person comes into your hospital or your institute, they have to wear masks, whether they're attenders, whether they're visitors, whether they're patients, or whether they're healthcare worker. That is what is universal masking. Physical distancing, hand washing, and awareness about these infectious diseases and how communicable they are. Triaging is important component. Make sure that they are triaged and people in triage wear PPE. If possible, have a separate building, have quarantine facilities for the healthcare worker. Those people who cannot have separate room where they can stay inside, for those people, hospitals should be able to give them some sort of a facility for the quarantine, give them good testing facility. As soon as a healthcare worker feels or says there has been a high risk exposure or have symptoms, we have to do a testing, thorough disinfection, cough etiquette, and vaccination. These are the important components whenever we are dealing with a pandemic like the sort we are dealing with, which is highly infectious. You can have small alterations like how we did. We just had this, that this came out, this plastic or sort of a glass partitions, and for our even ultrasound and other areas, we use these plastic curtains initially, which basically create some form of a physical barrier. So that is about the COVID or a pandemic situations, how the healthcare workers protect themselves. Coming to the labs, because these are the areas where we use many samples which are highly infectious. It can be a bacterial infection like a brucella, or it can be something like a melioidosis or a Burkholderia, or it can be viral infections, or like presently it can be something like a SARS-CoV-2. So lab safety is basically described as a containment principle, technologies or practices which are implemented to prevent any exposure to the pathogens. So this is the one where in the poll there was a second question was on what are the types of barriers for biosafety. First is the primary barriers, and the second is the secondary barriers. Primary barriers basically is the use of the biosafety cabinets, like different labs have different sorts of biosafety cabinets so that they are not exposed to the infections, having good centrifuges, good PPEs. They should wear a proper attire, have a good lab coat, gloves wherever they are required, and covered shoes, glasses or goggles, safety glasses, not the ordinary one, or goggles as per the risk assessment. Secondary barriers is appropriate facility device, that is design. Like infectious samples are not handled in the general area. And if you are dealing with tuberculosis, if you have a TB lab, then make sure that it is separate and there's there is some amount of a negative pressure and there is an exhaust out, special ventilation systems. These are all the secondary barriers which needs to be provided in a lab situation, and especially when you know that it is highly communicable diseases, there should be awareness among the healthcare workers to and the lab workers to make sure that these things, when provided by the hospital, are adhered to. Immunization is one thing which I think is very, very imperative, and we have understood its significance over the past decade. And many organizations and hospitals do have an immunization policies for their healthcare workers, like for hepatitis B, where they give in the first month 0 dose, 1 month, and 6 months. Flu, because now we have this pandemic, we are missing out this H1N1, though hopefully with the mask there is not a huge epidemic, or there is a huge outbreaks of H1N1, but we do see occasionally H1N1 also coming. So annual flu vaccinations are recommended. Varicella, for those who are not been exposed naturally or who have not taken varicella vaccine, this is very important. We do see outbreaks of these, especially around December, Jan. COVID-19 vaccinations, and for FNB or those who are working in the kitchen, typhoid vaccines, because it has been seen there is always a chance of diarrheal diseases being spread if appropriate hygiene is not followed at these levels. So each organization should have a policy for vaccination, and they should vaccinate as per schedule and well in ahead. Like, you know that there will be usual H1N1 in November, December in the winter season. So vaccinate at least 2 months prior, because we all know that the development of immunity takes some weeks, about 4 to 6 weeks. So vaccinate ahead of it. Similarly, varicella, we know it comes around Jan, Feb. So start vaccinating by October, November, or if you see spurt of cases, ensure that implemented. Something on a paper is not enough. Ensure that is implemented and document it somewhere. If you have a personal file, well and good. Otherwise, if there is in some form, do you have anything like in your employment register or somewhere, you can have this documentation and have a follow-up. 1 dose I have taken and I have not taken the second, third dose doesn't make sense. When an organization is giving you vaccines, ensure that after the first dose, whenever is my second dose due, I come back for that second dose. So to summarize the occupational safety, first thing, of course, is the control of infection at the source, that is the patient. The next priority is to protect the healthcare workers or the healthcare worker staff, those who are going to be in long contact, like in ICUs, you know that long time exposure for the doctors and the nurses and the housekeeping and physiotherapists, and whether there are any aerosol generating procedures. When we say aerosol generating procedures, it is like doing a suctioning or doing a bronchoscopy. These are all called aerosol generating procedure. If possible, have a good occupational safety department. You know, it can be headed by a microbiologist, it can be headed by infectious disease, or it can be headed by your director medical services or a medical superintendent. If you have that, then we can have many things in place, because the policies can be implemented, regular vaccinations can be done where immunization is required, the capturing of the needle stick injuries or a blood or body fluid exposure happening, that also can be looked at. Technologies can be implemented, and maybe also look at having a risk management policy, like, okay, in this area I'm seeing more NSIs, can I look at reducing or causing a risk mitigation there? Spreading the awareness among the healthcare workers. Many times, why do they don't report? Why is there underreporting? Because they don't even know. Like, we faced a situation about a few years back when many of the OT staff did not know that, okay, let the needle stick happen, and after 5-6 days we used to come that there was a needle stick injury a few days back. So then we started sensitization program, calling up them and telling them that they have to report, come back, get their baseline status done. So spreading the awareness about it, whether as a posters, whether you do some small programs or some occupational safety week, making them aware of it helps in spreading the awareness. Availability of infrastructure and resources is important. As I said, if you are saying hand hygiene, are they provided with an alcohol hand rub? Am I providing them with vaccination? Pre and post exposure prophylaxis? Encouraging the people to do the reporting of the incidents, because that fear should not be there. The moment there is a fear, there is underreporting, and maybe do some form of an exercise or a drill to make them aware and strengthening this. Health checks are one thing. Many of the hospitals are offering some form of an annual health check, and it can be again tweaked as per the areas they are working. You know, someone in a lab who is working in a tuberculosis center, you can do specific investigations for them, maybe an ESR or maybe a chest x-ray, and someone who is working in some other area, you can do specific to them. So like that, health checks can also be done annually. So these are some of the things which we can do for the safety of the healthcare workers. This is specific to the infectious diseases. Summarization in Telugu, Dr. Srinath will be summarizing it. Dr. Srinath.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the presentation. Telugulo chuddaamu ippudu manamu. సంక్రమణను తన మూలం అంటే రోగి వద్ద నియంత్రించడం అనేది మన ప్రాధాన్యత. ఎక్కడైతే సంక్రమణ జరుగుతుందో రోగి వద్దనే ఎక్కువ సంక్రమణ ఉంటుంది కాబట్టి అక్కడే మనము వాటిని అరికట్టడానికి చూస్తే సంక్రమణ ఇంకా పాకకుండా ఉంటుంది. మన యొక్క తదుపరి ప్రాధాన్యత రోగికి సంరక్షణ ఇచ్చే వాళ్ళని మరియు ఆరోగ్య సంరక్షణ సిబ్బందిని కాపాడటం. ఎక్కువ సమయం రోగి వద్ద ఉండటం, ఏరోసాల్ ఉత్పత్తి చేసే ప్రక్రియలు లేదంటే రోగి వద్ద ఎక్కువ సమయం ఉండడం అనేది సంక్రమణకు మనము ఎవరైతే ఆరోగ్య సంరక్షణ సిబ్బందులు ఉంటారో వాళ్లకు అలాంటి సమయాల్లో సంక్రమణ ఎక్కువ ఉంటుంది. వృత్తిపర భద్రత విభాగం, విద్య మరియు అవగాహన విభాగం ఏర్పాటు చేయండి. అంటే వీటి గురించి ఒక ప్రక్రియను లేదంటే ఒక పద్ధతిని అందరూ అనుసరించాలి అని చెప్పి మనము అనుకోవాలి. అలాగే దీని గురించి మనము అందరికీ చెప్పాలి కూడా. యజమానులను, ఉద్యోగులను వంటి వాటాదారులతో వృత్తిపరమైన ఆరోగ్య సంబంధిత సమస్యల గురించి అవగాహన కల్పించండి. ఎవరైతే స్టేక్ హోల్డర్స్ ఉంటారో, ఎవరైతే ఎంప్లాయీస్ ఉంటారో, ఎవరైతే హెల్త్ కేర్ వర్కర్స్ ఉంటారో అందరూ ఈ మనము సేఫ్ ఉండాలి అన్నట్టు మనము చెప్పుకోవాలి. మౌలిక సదుపాయాలు మరియు వనరుల లభ్యత, ఎక్స్పోజర్ ప్రొఫైల్ యాక్సెస్ గురించి కూడా మనము మాట్లాడుకోవాలి. అలాగే ఎవరైతే మేడం గారు చెప్పినట్లు ఒకవేళ మీరు ఒక ల్యాబ్ లో పనిచేస్తున్నారు అంటే ఒకవేళ అది టీబీ ల్యాబ్ అనుకోండి, మీరు ఆ ఎంప్లాయీకి టీబీకి సంబంధించిన పరీక్షలు అతి త్వరగా చేయించుకోవాలి. అంటే వెంటనే సంవత్సరానికి వార్షిక పరీక్షలు లేదంటే 6 నెలలకు ఒకసారి వాళ్ళకి ఆ తగిన పరీక్షలు చేస్తే వాళ్ళు కూడా సేఫ్ గా ఉంటారు. ధన్యవాదాలు.
So these are my references. Thank you, Srinath. Thank you so much. And thank you all.